In my neighborhood, survival isn't just about getting by, it's about standing up. When a young cop's prejudice led to a public humiliation I'll never forget, I uncovered a decades-old web of corruption tied to his powerful father. But here's the twist, that same cop. He might just be the key to bringing it all down. I'm Grace Sullivan, and this is the fight I was born to win, no matter the cost. Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. It started like any other morning at the community center. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the earthy smell of the old books we'd collected for the neighborhood library. I stood by the front desk, flipping through the schedule for the day, art classes for the kids, a job-seeking workshop, and our weekly seniors bingo night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. I had just stepped outside for a moment of fresh air when I saw him. The officer, young, sharp, and looking entirely out of place, was scanning the street like he owned it. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, and his sunglasses hid any hint of humanity in his expression. His presence didn't surprise me. We'd seen more patrols in recent months. They said it was to keep the peace. I knew better. "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" His voice was clipped, sharp, and laced with suspicion as he approached me. I folded my arms, suddenly aware of how tired I looked in my faded cardigan. "I could ask you the same thing. This is a community center, not a crime scene." "Do you work here?" he shot back, his tone skeptical. "More than work here. I built this place." My voice came out firmer than I expected, but I wasn't about to let him intimidate me. The officer, Calloway, his badge red, tilted his head as if considering my answer. Then he took a step closer, towering over me. "We've had reports of loitering and suspicious activity around this area. I'll need to see some ID." "Loitering? Suspicious activity?" My heart thudded against my ribs. I could feel the blood rush to my cheeks. This wasn't about suspicious activity. It was about me, a black woman standing in what he saw as his neighborhood. "Officer Calloway," I said, taking care to keep my voice calm even though my insides churned, "I don't know who gave you these reports, but you're mistaken. This is a place of community and safety." "That's not how it looks to me." His eyes narrowed. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to escort you downtown." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Years of working to make this center a beacon of hope, years of pouring my soul into this community, and this man had the audacity to treat me like a criminal? "You must be new around here," I said, trying to keep my composure. "Because anyone who's been here longer than 5 minutes knows exactly who I am." My words only seemed to provoke him further. Before I could react, he grabbed my arm. The firm grip sent a jolt of pain up to my shoulder. A small crowd started to gather, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the street. "Let her go," one of the kids from the art class yelled. "Officer, this is unnecessary," another voice chimed in. I tried to wrestle free, but his grip only tightened. "You're making a mistake," I said through gritted teeth, glaring up at him. "I don't make mistakes," he shot back, but there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Just then, a bystander pulled out their phone and started recording. Derek froze for half a second before letting go of my arm. He stepped back, adjusting his sunglasses, but the damage was already done. My arm throbbed, and the eyes of the crowd burned into both of us. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction now. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding and my pride in tatters. I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, each one reflecting a mix of anger, pity, and disbelief. My arm stung, but the deeper pain was in my chest, a sharp reminder of how little things had changed, even after all these years. I forced a small smile for the kids and waved them inside. "It's okay," I said, though I didn't quite believe it myself. "Let's get back to work." But as I stepped back into the center, I felt a storm brewing inside me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The video was everywhere by the time I got back to the precinct. Someone had posted it online, and it had gone viral faster than I could finish writing my report. My captain's face was like a thundercloud when I walked into his office. "Calloway," he barked. "Sit down." I hesitated before obeying. The room smelled of stale coffee and frustration. He leaned across his desk, tossing his phone in my direction. The screen showed the video, me gripping that old woman's arm, the crowd yelling, her looking at me with defiance in her eyes. My gut twisted. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. "She wasn't cooperating," I said, my voice hollow. "She refused to show ID, and there have been reports of." "Save it." He waved me off. "This is a PR nightmare, and you handed it to them on a silver platter." I clenched my fists under the desk. I was following protocol. Protocol? His laugh was bitter. "Do you think anyone cares about protocol when there's a headline screaming, 'Racist cop targets local hero'? She's practically a saint in that community." Her name was Grace Sullivan. I'd looked her up after the incident, trying to justify what had happened. The more I read, the more I realized just how badly I'd screwed up. A retired school principal, founder of the community center, and apparently beloved by everyone in the neighborhood. Not exactly the profile of a criminal. "She was resisting," I muttered, but even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. The captain shook his head, exhaling heavily. "Calloway, let me make this clear. The department isn't going to shield you from this. You're on your own." I left his office with a sick feeling in my stomach. The usual banter in the break room died the moment I walked in, replaced by awkward glances and hushed whispers. My colleagues weren't going to back me up, and I couldn't blame them. I'd become a liability. I spent the rest of the day going through the motions, patrolling the streets, responding to calls, but my head wasn't in it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grace Sullivan's face. There was something about her, something that lingered in my mind. She wasn't just angry, she was disappointed, like I'd let her down in a way that went beyond that moment. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a beer in one hand and my laptop in front of me. The video was still trending, with thousands of comments calling me every name under the sun. But what caught my attention were the stories people were sharing about Grace, how she'd helped them find jobs, kept kids off the streets, and fought for funding when no one else would. Why hadn't I known any of this? Why hadn't I seen her for who she was? I started digging deeper, searching for something, anything, that could justify what I'd done. Instead, I found a photograph that stopped me cold. It was an old black and white picture from a local history website. In it, a younger Grace stood arm in arm with a woman I recognized immediately. My mother. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. My mother had died when I was a teenager, but I still remembered her fiery speeches about justice and equality. She'd been an activist, always fighting for the little guy. I hadn't realized Grace had been a part of her world. I closed the laptop, trying to make sense of it all. Was that why Grace had looked at me the way she did? Did she know who I was? Did she see my mother in me? Or worse, did she see how far I'd fallen from the principles my mother had lived by? The next day, I drove back to the community center. I wasn't sure what I planned to say, but I knew I couldn't leave things as they were. When I pulled up, a group of kids playing basketball paused to glare at me. I ignored them and headed for the entrance. Inside, Grace was sitting at a table, going over what looked like a stack of grant proposals. She looked up when I approached, her eyes narrowing. "Officer Calloway," she said, her tone icy. "To what do I owe this honor?" I cleared my throat, suddenly unsure of myself. I came to apologize. Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't say anything. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. I didn't know who you were, I added, the words tumbling out. I didn't know about everything you've done for this community. And if you had, she asked, folding her hands on the table. Would it have changed anything? I hesitated, the weight of her question settling over me. I don't know. Her gaze pierced through me, and for the first time, I felt like she could see right past the badge, the uniform, the carefully constructed image I'd built. She nodded once, almost to herself, and then went back to her papers. Apology accepted, she said flatly. But if you're looking for absolution, you won't find it here. As I left the center, the kids outside still glaring, I realized she was right. Whatever came next, I'd have to earn it. After Calloway left the community center, I couldn't focus. His apology had caught me off guard, but it wasn't enough to erase what had happened. I couldn't shake the look in his eyes, something between guilt and desperation. It reminded me of another time, another officer, and the scars that still lingered beneath the surface. The truth was, this wasn't my first run-in with authority gone wrong. Decades ago, my family had been targeted by a corrupt cop, someone who thought their badge made them invincible. My father, a humble shopkeeper, had stood his ground against an unjust system, and he'd paid dearly for it. I'd spent my life trying to make sure no one else in this neighborhood would have to go through the same thing. And yet, here I was, bruised and humiliated, wondering if anything had really changed. I turned back to the stack of grant proposals on the table, trying to lose myself in work. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Calloway. His name felt familiar, like an itch in the back of my mind I couldn't quite scratch. I pulled out my laptop and started digging. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Officer Derek Calloway. New to the precinct, but already climbing the ranks thanks to his father, Captain Richard Calloway, a name I hadn't thought about in years. My chest tightened as old memories flooded back. Richard Calloway had been the officer who tore my family apart. Back in the 80s, when the neighborhood was in crisis, Captain Calloway had spearheaded a crackdown on illegal activities, which was just code for targeting black families like mine. My father had refused to pay the protection money Calloway's men demanded, and our store was raided under false pretenses. They never found anything illegal, but the damage was done. My father's reputation was ruined, and our family never recovered. And now, his son was walking the same path. The next morning, I met with Lionel, a lawyer and longtime friend who'd been helping me gather evidence against the precinct. He was waiting for me in his office, a cramped space filled with case files and half-empty coffee cups. "You're not gonna believe this," I said as I walked in, tossing my bag on the chair. "Derek Calloway. That's the officer who assaulted me." Lionel raised an eyebrow. "Calloway? As in Captain Calloway?" I nodded, and he let out a low whistle. "That family's been untouchable for decades. If the son's anything like the father, you've got a fight on your hands." "That's why I'm here," I said, pulling out the folder of documents we'd been collecting. "It's time to move forward with the case." Lionel leaned forward, scanning the papers. "This is good, Grace. But it's not enough. We need something explosive, something that'll force the city to take action." Later that day, I went back to the center, still buzzing with energy from my meeting with Lionel. But when I walked into my office, I found an envelope on my desk. There was no name, no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in blocky handwriting. I opened it cautiously, and my breath caught when I saw what was inside. Police reports, internal memos, and emails, all pointing to a coordinated effort to target my community under the guise of crime prevention. But what shocked me most was the name at the bottom of one of the memos, Captain Richard Calloway. The implications hit me like a freight train. Someone inside the department had sent this to me, and I had a pretty good idea who it was. Derek. That evening, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the documents spread out across the table. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't just about the corruption, it was personal. Captain Calloway's signature was on the order to raid my father's shop all those years ago. And now, his son was trying to make amends by exposing his own family's crimes. I thought back to the look in Derek's eyes when he apologized. It wasn't just guilt, it was pain. He knew what his father had done, and he was trying to fix it. But was it enough? Could I trust him? The sound of my phone buzzing broke through my thoughts. It was Lionel. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, his voice urgent. "One of my contacts in the precinct just tipped me off. There's been chatter about shutting down the community center. They're planning to use this whole incident as an excuse to pull your funding." My stomach dropped. "How much time do we have?" "Not long," he said. "The city council meeting is next week. If we don't present our case by then, it's over." A ticking clock. Just what I needed. The next day, I called a meeting with the community leaders and activists who had been working with me for years. We gathered in the center's main hall, a space filled with the echoes of laughter and resilience. I stood at the front, clutching the envelope Derek had left for me. "We've got 1 week to save this center," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "And we're going to do it by exposing the truth." I laid out the documents on the table for everyone to see. Gasps rippled through the room as they read the damning evidence. But there was also a fire in their eyes, a determination I hadn't seen in a long time. "This isn't just about the center," I continued. "This is about justice for every family that's been targeted, every child who's been labeled a criminal before they even had a chance to grow up. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time since the incident, I felt a glimmer of hope. But as I stood there, looking out at the faces of my neighbors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a storm. The Calloways weren't going to go down without a fight. And if Derek's father got wind of what we were planning, there was no telling what he might do. The precinct was quieter than usual when I walked in. Conversations hushed as I passed, and I could feel the weight of every gaze on my back. Word had spread about Grace Sullivan, the community center, and the documents I'd leaked. I thought I'd been careful, but someone had put 2 and 2 together. I was a traitor now, and they weren't going to let me forget it. I avoided the break room and went straight to my desk, trying to focus on the paperwork in front of me. But it was no use. My thoughts were a whirlwind of doubts and regrets. Grace had probably seen the documents by now. I'd hoped they would help, but the truth was, I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore. "Calloway," a voice barked behind me. I turned to see my father, Captain Richard Calloway, standing in the doorway of his office. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "In my office. Now." I followed him in, shutting the door behind me. He didn't offer me a seat. Instead, he leaned against his desk, arms crossed, glaring at me like I was a rookie who just botched his first arrest. "What the hell are you doing, Derek?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped. "Those documents, where did they come from? And don't even try to tell me you didn't have anything to do with it." My chest tightened, but I kept my face blank. "Maybe you should be asking why those documents exist in the first place." His eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, son." I clenched my fists at my sides, fighting the urge to lash out. "I've been watching my tone my whole life, Dad. I've been doing everything you told me to do, following the rules, upholding the badge. But this? What you did to Grace Sullivan's family, to that entire community? That's not justice." He stepped closer, his voice a growl. "You think you know better than me? Everything I've done to protect this department, this family. You don't get to question that. This family? I spat, finally losing my composure. You're not protecting this family, you're protecting yourself. You think I don't know about the bribes, the cover-ups? You think I don't see the damage you've done? His hand twitched like he wanted to hit me, but he stopped himself. You don't understand what it takes to survive in this job, Derek. But you will. I shook my head, disgusted. I already do. And I'm done surviving. It's time for something to change. I turned and walked out before he could say another word. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. I didn't know what would come of that confrontation, but one thing was clear, I couldn't go back. Not to him, not to the precinct, not to the way things were. That night, I sat in my car outside the community center, staring at the glowing windows. Kids were playing basketball under the streetlights, their laughter echoing through the night. Grace was inside, no doubt rallying her people, preparing for whatever was coming next. I knew she didn't trust me, and I couldn't blame her. But I needed to talk to her. I needed her to know I wasn't like my father. I stepped out of the car and walked to the entrance, ignoring the glares from the group of teens gathered nearby. Inside, the center was bustling with activity, volunteers organizing papers, community leaders discussing strategies. Grace stood at the center of it all, a commanding presence even in her quiet determination. When she saw me, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here, Calloway?" I held up my hands, a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." She crossed her arms, skeptical. "You've said enough already." "Please," I said, lowering my voice. "Just hear me out." After a long pause, she nodded toward her office. I followed her inside, shutting the door behind us. The room was small and cluttered, but it felt warm, lived in. She sat behind her desk, watching me like a hawk. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "But I need you to understand, I'm not my father." Her eyes softened, but only slightly. "You've got a long way to go before anyone believes that." "I know," I said, swallowing hard. "But I'm trying. That's why I gave you those documents." Her eyebrows rose. "So it was you." I nodded. "I thought they might help. I know it's not enough, but it's all I could do." She studied me for a long moment, then leaned back in her chair. "You're right. It's not enough. But it's a start." The relief that washed over me was brief, overshadowed by the enormity of what lay ahead. Together, we were about to take on a system that had protected my father and men like him for decades. And there was no guarantee we'd win. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right side of the fight. The city council chamber was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched to the back wall, where people stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously. The air buzzed with tension, and the heat of so many bodies in the small space made it stifling. This was it, our chance to present the truth, to expose everything that had been swept under the rug for years. I stood at the front with Lionel by my side, a thick folder of documents clutched in my hands. My heart raced, but I kept my face calm. I'd faced down worse than this before. Still, the stakes had never felt higher. If we failed today, the center would close, and the system that had terrorized my community for decades would tighten its grip. From the corner of my eye, I saw Derek Calloway slip in through a side door. He wasn't in uniform, and his posture was stiff, as though he were walking into enemy territory. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. I nodded back. We were unlikely allies, but we needed each other now. The council chairperson called the meeting to order, her gavel striking the table sharply. "Ms. Sullivan, you have the floor." I stepped forward, my voice steady as I addressed the room. "Thank you, Chairperson Diaz." I'm here today not just for myself but for the countless families who have suffered under a broken system. What happened to me last week wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, one that's been allowed to fester for far too long. I laid the documents on the table, spreading them out so the council members could see. These are internal police memos, reports, and emails detailing targeted actions against this community. They weren't protecting us, they were profiling us. And it wasn't just a few bad apples. It was systemic, organized, and deliberate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I saw heads turning, whispers spreading like wildfire. The council members leaned forward, scanning the documents with growing alarm. But this isn't just about the past, I continued. The community center I run is at risk of being shut down, all because it stands as a symbol of resistance. This isn't about crime prevention. It's about silencing voices. Just as I finished, a voice cut through the murmurs. And you have no proof of that. I turned to see Captain Richard Calloway standing near the back, his arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled fury. The sight of him made my blood boil, but I didn't let it show. "Captain Calloway," I said, my tone measured. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why your name appears on so many of these documents?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on him now. For a moment, he looked like he might storm out, but then he straightened and strode toward the front. "I don't have to explain anything," he said, his voice cold. "This is nothing but a smear campaign from a woman who doesn't understand how law enforcement works." "That's where you're wrong," another voice said. Derek stood, his face pale but resolute. "I've seen how it works. And I'm done being part of it." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Captain Calloway's face twisted in disbelief as his son walked to the front. "You don't know what you're doing," the captain hissed. "Yes, I do," Derek replied, his voice steady. "I'm doing what you should have done a long time ago, telling the truth." Derek turned to the council and the crowd, his voice growing stronger with each word. "My father and others in this department have abused their power for decades. They've targeted communities of color, destroyed families, and silenced anyone who dared to speak out. I can't change what's happened, but I can make sure it stops here." He placed a USB drive on the table. "This contains more evidence, audio recordings, internal communications, everything you need to hold the people responsible accountable." The room exploded in applause. People stood, cheering and clapping, their voices ringing out like a battle cry. Tears stung my eyes as I looked at Derek. For the first time, I saw not just the shadow of his father but a man trying to carve his own path. The council adjourned after promising to review the evidence and halt any plans to defund the center until an investigation was complete. As people filed out, they stopped to shake my hand, offering words of encouragement and gratitude. Derek lingered at the back, waiting until the room was nearly empty before approaching me. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice soft. "Yes, I did," he replied. "For you. For the community. For my mother." I blinked, caught off guard. "Your mother? She used to talk about you," he said, a faint smile breaking through the tension on his face. "She admired you. Always said you were the bravest person she knew." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "She was braver than any of us." He nodded, his gaze distant. "I just hope I didn't wait too long to do the right thing." "It's never too late," I said, offering him a small smile. "But you've got a lot of work ahead of you." He laughed softly, a sound tinged with relief. "I think I can handle it." As he walked out into the night, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I believed we might actually win.